Morning all. I usually don't need a microphone for a room this size, but I'm going to cover some projects we've been working on. May seem a long way. My Gulf of Mexico office, based in Houston, Texas, from the European Commission, but with an all-Atlantic theme, and I think it's relevant. Some of you may have seen a few of these slides before from my presentation in Rio, but So I'm going to cover some projects and partnerships that we're working on, and then move into some industry needs for ocean data and really what underpins why we participate in ocean science, some future opportunities hopefully, and then a fun example of some stakeholder engagement. So our probably largest projects right now are the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 project and the contributions we're making of data there. An HF radar that we've installed in southern Louisiana, and the National Academy of Science funded UGOS program, which, if nobody's familiar with, is some of the BP settlement from Deepwater Horizon and the utilization of those funds for understanding the Gulf system with a focus on energy safety and the environment. Ooh. There you go. So Seabed 2030, we've taken the opportunity between our specific project sites to collect high-resolution multi-beam data on our transits when legally possible. Situations such as a country such as Brazil will not allow us to map within their EEZ and make the data publicly available, but that's a challenge that we have to live with. I understand India is the same, but a tremendous amount of data can be collected on transit routes as we move vessels around the world. There's a slide later where you will see all of the vessels that we have operating. All right, bring me on to our HF radar network. So this was the coverage map from a couple of days ago. The eastern seaboard down the Carolinas does actually have radar coverage, but most were taken out by hurricane. And the challenge of academic research institutions to get them back online. This brings me to why Fugro was interested in installing the sites as an industry partner. We've treated the radar sites as any other piece of equipment in our equipment pool. So we have full commercial insurance against those. We also have a lot of our classical energy clients working out of Port Fourchon in southern Louisiana, and as such can provide a value add building on the data collected, matched with shipborne data that we're collecting and supporting those clients in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's ours right there at the tip of the Mississippi. The Shell Stones National Academy's Ocean Observing System. So in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a requirement of collecting 1,000 meters of currents from the surface to 1,000 meters depth for all deep water development sites. So we started with one mooring on the left-hand side, providing wind, waves, and currents to 1,000 meters to tick the box of requirement for the Gulf of Mexico operation. Utilizing some additional funding from the National Academies, we've now expanded this to add the secondary mooring, transmitting data back to the first mooring using the telemetry and returning it to the beach in near real time. So we have hourly updates with 20-meter incremental currents through 2,950 meters of water. I think it's probably the only one it's working well because the acoustic links are less than ideal, but at 6 monthly service visits, we do upload all of the data, so there's a full time series of data that's being provided and is publicly available. Okay, my pet project is some industry CTD casts. So all of the offshore survey companies globally collect a tremendous amount of CTD casts and only use the sound velocity profile to help calibrate USBL or multibeam. And all the rest of the data goes in the garbage. So I've got a initiative to convert that data and take the CTD cast. I think Fugro's averaging about 40 a day of CTD cast globally. And if I can get this workflow and deliver it in the buffer format to JCOM ops, making it, using the FAIR principles of data, then we can publicize ourselves and advertise what we're doing and these wonderful contributions of freely accessible data for only that. But it's cheaper advertising, me working my pet project than putting ads in the newspaper, I suppose. Why industry is important in these partnerships. We had a couple of instances based on the collaborative work we're doing with GCUS, or the Gulf Coast branch of IUS. I received a phone call on 13th September that they had a Navo glider loose in the Gulf of Mexico in a distressed state, and they had no vessels available to make the recovery. So with a 2 in the afternoon phone call, I was able to get a vessel on charter insured by midnight, and the Navy glider was recovered and back in port by 2 o'clock that day. This sort of responsiveness isn't necessarily always possible at academic universities or institutions that are working in these areas. It worked so well that 2 weeks later they decided to test me again. I don't know if anyone went to Ocean Obs in Hawaii, but the 27th of September was the first day of the conference. So everyone was traveling to Hawaii and no one available again. This time it was just crossing the border 200 miles south of Louisiana into the Mexican EEZ. So slightly more critical to not have to worry about customs export on recovery in Mexico. But we were able to recover just on the border and get the glider recovered. This was done purely at cost. There was no markup. There was no margin. In fact, I actually took a loss because I have to pay for the insurances on the charter party myself. But great for the community spirit. A couple of new projects now. The Mayflower Wind LiDAR buoy. I know there's been a tremendous amount of renewable work in the European region. It's still in its infancy on the east coast of the United States. So building on some of the partnerships, Shell as 50% stakeholder in this joint venture, also participating with GCUS, have allowed us to make all of the data from this wind LiDAR buoy publicly available. So again, using FAIR principles and utilizing the NERACUS, or the Northeast Regional Ocean Observing Branch of IUS in the US, we're going to deliver all of this data for 2 years of sustained measurements, possibilities of extensions up to 5 years. And Atlantic Shores. Same again, but in New Jersey. So now I have a new regional association, NERACUS, to work with. So all the challenges of multiple data formats, but performing just the same. So Fugro vessels providing data to the voluntary observing system. So we have met stations for our own use and weather forecasting improvement to support our projects. That was a week ago's positioning of all of the Fugro vessels globally. So when transiting between these sites, such as Brazil and the Gulf of Mexico, we continue to map and contribute to Seabed 2030, but also sustained meteorological observations from the MET stations on board to contribute to the voluntary observing system. Okay, industry needs. Why is industry out there collecting data? Really, it comes down to criteria. We either need criteria to optimize a weather window for when energy companies are working in sea, and or designing offshore structures, or monitoring field conditions for during field operations to continue safe. So this is where we're making measurements. For any of these measurements, we can't understand why it has to be so secret. Right? There's a tremendous amount of opportunity for contribution of this data, even in a subsampled, non-engineering grade data set, to be contributing to a safer and more livable world. The key being stakeholder engagement as well for sustained measurements. So when we can utilize existing industry cruises where we go and make these measurements and open them up to university collaboration, academic collaboration, we can save a tremendous amount of ship time. So some future opportunities. We're working on expanding the industry, CTD data delivery to make it all publicly available. Data mining, project archives. We have 10 years of CTD casts that are stored that I'm trying to unbox, unarchive, check positions, QC. I'm working on getting all the Fugro vessels there. We need to work on engagement with offshore energy companies and expanding their basic measurements to make the motion observing systems, sustaining these especially production facilities that are there in the sea for 20, 25 years. Promote the UN Ocean Decade, Seabed 2030, and here's a fun example. So around stakeholder engagement, people think, well, what's important? So this is yesterday's GIF of the RTOS currents as they pass the island of Cozumel in the Yucatan. So we've got a tremendous study going on with UGOS and the National Academy's funding to characterize the inflow of the loop current here. But this is actually a small GIF I make on a daily basis and provide to a dive operator in Cozumel. And all they care about is if the currents are flowing north through the channel between Cozumel and the Yucatan, or if the western boundary currents move out from the coast a little bit and they get a counter current. Because if they get a counter current, they drop the divers in the wrong location and they don't see anything except for sandstorms in the channel when they're diving instead of the reefs. So we provide this. From this, the dive company's happy to deploy some Lagrangian drifters for me for no charge in the channel that will then help characterize the inflow into the Gulf of Mexico and calibrate with the HF radar network that's being deployed on the Yucatan. So that's my spiel.
Thank you. Ben, this was an excellent contribution, and I would like to know, I know that you can speak for Fugro only, but I could imagine that you have a good insight into the industry itself. You are releasing data free of charge to the whole world. I know that some scientists are refusing giving data out because they think that data should be charged for if they go to industry. How do you think is the rest of the global industry dealing with data? Are they releasing data as you do it free of charge, or what is the feeling in industry?
The largest challenge I find is sort of geographic. We discussed in Brazil the limitations on Navy licenses and hydrographic licenses to permit that sharing outside of Brazil. But there are paths to contribute to the ocean observing groups in each of these countries. From an industry perspective, we see more and more sustainability objectives, right? Even in your hotel room of how many times you're going to have your towels washed in your 3 or 4 days here. These are goals to improve the profile of industry and be seen as operating sustainably. Well, the same should apply for anybody who's operating in the ocean, that the contribution to data being fair is pivotal to being seen as a sustainable company or a sustainable research institution contributing to a better world.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, we heard from the earlier presentations about how Blue Cloud and other initiatives are wanting to make these cloud data available to others beyond researchers and reaching out to industry and other potential users. To what extent you've been very generous in providing data up, to what extent have you been consulted in UN Decade or other initiatives about what you need from these data resources that are being built?
Yeah, there's been limited consultation coming the other way. Some of that is the fact that I'm not an energy company and I am a service provider. So if there's a tremendous amount of freely available data, I'm going to struggle to convince my clients that they should pay me for measurements. So I'm happy to continue telling them they need to pay me to make measurements and then continue to sample that data and make it freely available. So how the data flow works, when we do desktop studies and know there's publicly available data of good quality, then we utilize that, report on that, QC that, and deliver that as data products to these clients as well.
So if you could tell them that if you did this, this is what you would get back from it, that might be more a convincing case for you to make more data available from under other industry
Correct.
groups. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you release the data, so when if the company is happy to release the data, do you feel that you need some kind of place to or some kind of a way to make this data available, or that already you think that through the infrastructure? So and in the same way, from Sandra, do you think that eClouds could provide these universal portal that could get this data from the companies if they are happy to release the data, in order to make accessible later on? Because the problem is, okay, I am happy to release the data, but where I should release these data in such a way that they will be available, and also in the other side that the quality of this data could be enough, or we can know about the quality of those data.
Yes, so I'm privileged enough to work with the IUS group in the U.S. and through their regional associations. So for U.S. specific data contributing to GCUS, MARICUS, NERACUS, and all of those, they all have data management facilities that have been accredited now through NOAA's standard. So they have to meet the QC requirements to be submitted, and then it's publicly available through that IUS framework. I would hope and assume the same is applicable for EURACUS. Yep, so.
In fact, there are also in Europe, let's say, we're doing comparable things. That's partly you're talking about operational data, of course, the EURACUS, the regions, the RUSES, as we call them. But also we do another one which is called an ingestion portal, AORAC ingestion, by which we invite everybody who has data and who are not yet part of the mainstream, let's say, structures, to in fact ingest their data, and then it will be worked up by qualified data centers. And after a while, if we see that there's only just a piece of the iceberg, let's say, then we get in contact to see if there's more, and then to make really a structural flow of data to those data centers. And that's working very nicely. Let's say the project is now on the road for 2.5 years. And there's quite a big interest, not only from industry, but also from, let's say, university scientists who also have not found a way to the repositories, which are therefore also for them. Another thing is that we also do a project with major oil companies. It's called SIMORG, and that has been going on now for more than 12 years.
Correct.
And I'm the coordinator of that project.
Okay.
And that's with Shell, with Total, with BP. And in fact, there we get all the Metocean data which is acquired on offshore sites. And the only thing is that there is some sort of a data policy. That means that people have to be registered and have to request, and they have to explain a little bit why they want to use the data. And then the companies, they expect some, let's say, some return of their investment, not in money, but more in having a report that they also see what is the added value of that data. But those are initiatives that are quite well working, and also supported by the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, and also Fugro, of course, is well acquainted with that network.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think letters of support or emails of support or a message of support from these regional associations that we can involve in our contract negotiations and contract discussions. You bring up Total. It's in the specs I get sent every time that if I'm going to collect the data, it needs to be compatible and similar. So.
Adding up to what just had been said, and understanding that you have quite some experience in working with Brazil and the South Atlantic, shall I say. How do you perceive the difference in say, attitudes between oil companies down there and elsewhere in the world regarding data availability? I'm sorry, data, availability,
availability
to all,
Yeah, there's a tremendous challenge in Brazil specifically with the vast amount of data that Petrobras has collected, and that they still see it as a very valuable commodity everywhere they've collected it to utilize for their partners as more international investment occurs in Brazil. So giving up all the freely available data that they've collected in Sergipe-Alagoas would let someone like ExxonMobil off the hook of making the same level of collections and contributing that data back to Petrobras and Sempes. And this is a mindset that we have to change, that the additional data is to augment the data set, and additional data still needs to be collected. I work very closely with the folks at Petrobras. We've had many contracts for the 15 years I've worked for Fugro collecting data for them. But they don't want to give a free ride to the IOCs as they come in, which is fair, and the biggest stumbling block there. I've seen very similar in India. But as the developing nations improve their economy and bring things forward, I think a more world view may come in sustainability objectives, and I think that there's opportunities for improvement and change there.
So you see a big difference between what happens there than what happens elsewhere, like in the Gulf of Mexico or the Mississippi estuary. It's different, is it?
It's very different, yeah. I mean, we are mandated from data collection, and the energy companies are mandated to make that data available in the U.S., whereas that doesn't exist in South America as much.
There is the last question there. Before, I just wanted to add a comment to what you said before, because you mentioned building this universal portal. So that's not really the purpose. So we don't want to build one universal portal, but the challenge is to interconnect the existing players, because we know that there are already good examples of data management, data storage, and whatever. So we just want all the players to be able to exchange their data and their best practices. So we don't want to build an extra layer that needs to be funded and maintained. So that's the purpose. Sorry. Go.
Well, thank you. I just want to support that. That's the key statement. And this was such a good presentation, because without the industrial sector, how on earth can we deal with the challenges that we're actually trying to deal with at the moment in terms of global monitoring and so forth? So I also wanted to just add one point of detail. Some of the discussions with the oil and gas sector also come down to the crunchy issues of confidentiality, non-disclosure, risk perception, working with environmental data sets, subsea video data sets, for instance. But these can be got around. We've partnered very strongly through Atlas and previous projects to get through those issues, get the lawyers together and hammer it out. It can be done, and there's lots of good practice, which I think we can share widely across the Atlantic Basin, which may start to chip away at where there are blocks. And I can understand why those blocks are there. And we've workshopped that over the last few years and written a few papers on that. So I think that's a kind of key issue, but you have to deal with it up front.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree completely. The challenge often occurs that the contract is negotiated purely by the lawyers, and the science is completely negotiated by the scientists. And that's sort of my key role in Fugro in Houston, that I have to sit at both tables all the time. I'm always the dumbest person at both tables, but it's nice to learn something, right?
Okay.